The 1920s are a reaction to the World War I and the absolute carnage and cataclysm that Americans experienced. Well, there were only 1.2 million American servicemen deployed to Europe. What they saw, what they witnessed, what they experienced would forever scar them. And then while they were gone, the role of women changing in the workplace, taking the jobs that the nation needed filled, transformed American society. As my dear friend and colleague says, this is the end of the ancien regime, the end of the old order. And so what takes place in America in the 1920s is a social revolution. And one of the things that I like to ask as an essay question regarding the 1920s is this time period is often called the Roaring '20s. So what put the roar in the 20s? What made the 20s so compelling, so different, so unique that it stood out of all the decades of the 20th century and it was called the Roaring '20s? Well, first off, you have a social revolution of the highest order. 1924 is as different from 1914 as any span of 10 years in the history of America, maybe even the history of the world. The nation undergoes a fundamental transformation. And you see a large part of that on the board. I've collected McClure's Judge Life Classic magazine covers, and this is just a small sampling of the hundreds I could have put up here. For time's sake, didn't. But you see in each of these something that expresses this social revolution that takes place. So we'll just start at one point and we'll work our way around. And please understand, I'm trying to be as sensitive and non-offensive in language, but in some of this, it requires talking about topics that you normally wouldn't address in a classroom. So starting at the top with the bandstand and the ladies singing, look at the ladies in all of the covers, and that's one of the key. This is the age of the woman growing out of the farmhouse into industry, into city life. How are you going to put, as one of the songs, how are you going to put the boy back on the farm once he's seen Gay Paris? Well, how are you going to put the woman back in the farmhouse once she's been into the workplace, once she's seen industry? And so women in expressing their new place in society, hemlines went up, necklines went down, whereas a decade before it had been considered vulgar, almost a prostitute if you showed your ankle in society. Now women are wearing dresses that are mid-thigh, low cut, exposing more of their body to the gaze of society. Not only is their dress hemline going up, but in all of the pictures you can see rolled down stockings, stockings symbolizing underwear, the display in effect of their underwear that it stops here. You see the gaudy makeup. These women were called flappers, and they were called flappers for a number of reasons, one being the Charleston and the dance that they do, expressed in one of the magazine covers. But flappers because undergarments that normally the stays and the corsets that were worn under dresses just a decade before now aren't worn, and body parts are allowed to flap around. So part of the flapper is from the revolution in a woman expressing her body publicly. The jewelry, gaudy jewelry, designed to draw attention to the neckline that's now exposed, considered an erogenous zone. The heavy makeup emphasizing the eyes and the lips, while a lot of times having a white face, a very washed out, powdered face, but with crimson lips and blue make-upped eyes to draw attention to the eyes and mouth and the sensual features of the face. But even more than that, even more than the defiance of the old social order, you see in the picture with the guy, a woman applying the makeup, and he's offering her a drink. Well, that's doubly bad because a woman drinking in public just wasn't done, and the fact that now, because of the 18th Amendment, booze is illegal in public. And so you have a woman drinking in public. Now, that's not to say that women didn't drink before. They just did it in private. If a husband and wife wanted to have a drink in the house, they could. But if men and women were mixed in a social setting, the men would withdraw to the library or the study. The women would just withdraw to the sewing room, and the two sexes would separate, and they might have drinks separately, but they certainly didn't drink in mixed company. Smoking, you see him defiantly smoking, and although there's not one specifically with her smoking on here, women smoking in public, same thing. Women smoked privately, but not in public. It was considered vulgar or rude. Women driving, the beginning of a stereotype. The clashing of gears and the dropping of the transmission because she doesn't know how to drive a stick shift. Well, I would say that most of you today don't know how to drive a standard shift. With the automatic transmissions being the order of the day, you would have the same problem if you were suddenly put into a standard shift automobile and asked to drive. And so the social revolution, transforming a woman's role in society from the quiet wallflower that's supposed to make supper and tend to the housework, till now she's a social structure. She's out amongst society living. She's doing the Charleston, a dance that is syncopated. It's in effect puts a woman on display, as you can see in the different poses and moves. And by the way, the woman on the bottom is wearing a banana suit. Those are bananas, fake, but bananas attached to her suit for the routine that she was doing. But public dance troupes traveling the nation, performing the Charleston, and the Charleston then catching on as a dance move, and people attending these public displays, watching the Charleston performed, and then they go out that evening to where that dance troupe's performing with the band, and they pay their cover charge or whatever, and they go in and dance, using the dance steps that they learned in the public performance. But the idea of a mass dance appeal, crossing the nation, and people around the United States performing the same dance to the same movie. This had never been done before. But popular culture and popular entertainment sweeping the nation. So the Charleston, and Charleston by no means is the only dance that sweeps the nation, but is emblematic of the new dance culture. Women and men interacting on the dance floor in ways that you just simply don't do with a waltz or a cotillion. More intimate, more syncopated, more movement of the body that's suggestive. And so the Charleston puts the roar in the 20s. Another aspect that puts the roar in the 20s is the age of music, especially jazz music, coming out of the African-American culture of New Orleans and Memphis. Two different types of jazz, but out of the Mississippi River Valley coming the syncopated rhythms of jazz music that swept the country. Whether it be King Oliver's Creole Band that you see on the bottom, and you see on the opposite side King Oliver himself, and then playing trumpet in King Oliver's band was probably the greatest jazz musician of his day, Louis Armstrong. In fact, of his day, he would be the most popular jazz player of the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s. But jazz music, and it breaks the color barrier. We often talk about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in sports. Well, jazz music allowed black entertainers to break the color barrier and become more mainstream as they performed around the nation. Jazz became a craze, if you will. And then those who sang the various derivatives of jazz, in this case the blues. Empress of the blues, Bessie Smith, a powerhouse singer who brought her childhood as an orphan from the streets of Tennessee, brought that to her singing. Powerful music in its sadness, in its elicitation of empathy, but also its defiance of society and cultural norms. Bessie Smith's music struck a chord across the nation, carried by the radio. The radio, that source of entertainment within the household. And as you can see, the family circle gathered around the radio listening to program. Whether that program would be a mystery, whether it would be a soap opera. Most of the soap operas that are still on TV today have their origin in radio. Dramatic presentations. In fact, you see the Clico Club companies, Clico Club Eskimos. It was believed back in the day that Americans wouldn't sit still to have their programs interrupted by advertising. So what advertisers would do is they would buy blocks of time. So Clico Club soda, it's ginger ale. Clico Club will ultimately be bought out by Canada Dry. But Clico Club was the American equivalent of ginger ale. And it would buy an hour of time, and they had their own in-house band, the Clico Club Eskimos, that would play a derivative of bluegrass, judging from the banjos that they all have. But they would buy a block of time, usually an hour, and the Clico Club Eskimos would perform. And if you liked their music, you tuned in and listened. And that block of time was sponsored by Clico Club, and the idea is if you like the music, then you'll go out and buy their product. Same thing with spark plugs, the Champion Spark Plug Hour, featuring the Champion Sparkers. And they play their music. When my wife and I first got married in 1990, we were too poor to go out to the movies and didn't have a TV. Originally because we couldn't afford it, and by agreement, my wife wanting to establish a firm relationship before TV intrudes, and we went our separate ways to watch shows. So we agreed to 2 years without a TV, and 2 years became 5 years, even though we could afford it. We just simply didn't want it. But no TV in the household meant more communication within the family. Well, before TV, there was radio. And the family centered around the radio, listening to whatever the program was of the day. Oh, yeah, my point of my story. When we first got married, we were too poor to go out. So we had my stereo, and on Saturday afternoons, Saturday evenings, Mississippi Public Radio would have the Bluegrass Hour. And usually that was followed by another bluegrass program, and I happened to like bluegrass. She did too. So our evenings we would spend, at our apartment having canned tamales or canned soup and listening to public radio playing the bluegrass. And that was high quality entertainment for the first couple of years of our marriage, so we could afford to do something else. But you have that family time. You see the kids playing as they listen to the radio. And this unity of purpose, if you will, family time becomes centered around a medium. And that radio could be playing not only music, but sporting events or news. Later generations, the radio would be replaced by the TV. Today, the TV's been replaced by the computer and handheld devices, and now instead of a community event, it's more individualistic, with each person being able to go off and do what they want. There's not that unity of family and unity of purpose that the radio seemed to provide. What else put the roar in the 20s? Well, movies put the roar in the 20s. The first talkie, if you will, the movie with a soundtrack. Now, movies had been around before. Remember in World War I, Wilson effectively uses George Creel to manipulate public opinion, using the movies and that intermission at the movies to talk to the American people with their 4-minute men. Well, in the case of Al Jolson's The Jazz Singer, that was the first talkie in which the soundtrack was embedded in the film. And so along with the film, you could hear the actual actors talking. And the reason, by the way, the poster for the movie is the way it is Al Jolson is in blackface. Back in the day, if an actor wanted to play a different character, or, and this gets into psychoanalysis, wanted to be liberated to express their artistic technique, a lot of times black actors appeared in whiteface, white actors appeared in blackface, but it grows out of the earlier types of entertainment, if you will, the traveling minstrel shows, and then into vaudeville and on into Hollywood. But The Jazz Singer and the talkie is then followed by the first Technicolor film and The Wizard of Oz. The first film to be filmed in Technicolor and colorized for its impact with the American people. So the transformation of the movie industry. Well, what does the movie industry do for America? How could you say it puts the roar? Well, you've got the roar of the crowds, but also with the film you have all of the other aspects, the production of it, Hollywood icons growing out of these movies, and the American people's desire to emulate what they see on the big screen. America has become and is becoming a consumer culture. And so they see an actor or an actress on the screen, no matter how stupid it is, they decide to copy it. Copy whatever fashion or whatever hairstyle or whatever look that sweeps the nation and transforms the marketplace. Think about today. Every time a Disney movie comes out, the truckloads of toys that accompany that. If I never hear another Let It Go, it will be too soon. My daughter's loving Frozen. Well, that's, begins in the 1920s with the movie stars of the 20s setting fashion trends for the nation. And although it wasn't marketed the way it is now, this is the beginning of that. Whole industries created to support these Hollywood icons and these Hollywood movies. The idea of the blockbuster soon following on the end of The Wizard of Oz. Grand spectacles of C.C. DeMille and just over-the-top glamorization of Hollywood. What else puts the roar in the 20s? Professional sports. Now with the radio, with the telegraph, with the newspaper, there can be a nationwide following. And so icons rise to national prominence, whether that be Bobby Jones in golf, Jack Dempsey in boxing, Red Grange in football, Babe Ruth, whom I'm sure everybody's heard of, Ty Cobb, and then Johnny Weissmuller. Johnny Weissmuller being a swim champion, one of the first Americans to win multiple gold medals in swimming events at the Olympics. That catapulted him to fame, but many of you, if you were into early TV, when I was a kid, one of the shows that was quite popular on TV, and it was even old in my day, so don't look this up, the dates on it, and think that I'm that old. My grandfather happened to like Tarzan. Well, Johnny Weissmuller was probably the best Tarzan that ever took the screen. But he catapulted into that Hollywood fame from his swimming abilities. And so professional sports. Well, think of all the industries that arise from professional sports. You have the arena itself, you have the stadium, you have the vendors at the stadium, but then that sets off, you're following your key player and you want to buy their jersey. For instance, I went to TCU. I'm a huge fan of Andy Dalton because he went to TCU. I watch him play for the Bengals. I've got an autographed Bengals helmet that's autographed by Andy Dalton. I don't care a thing in the world about the Bengals. No offense to you if you do, but You know, I watch them and I cheer them on because of one guy, and fantasy football has kind of opened that up for a lot of people. But this is where it starts, in the 20s, following the Detroit Tigers because of Ty Cobb, or the Red Sox, and then later the Yankees. In the 20s, it would be the Yankees with Babe Ruth. Chicago Bears because of Red Grange. You know, so the transformation of sports into a national following and national icons and national figures that the American public rallies around and enjoys watching and celebrates their accomplishments or their defeats. And all of this is predicated in 1920 after the 1919 scandal of the fixing of the World Series. You know, professional sports needed the radio, needed that national following to overcome the setback that sports had in the 1919 with the 1920s successes of Babe Ruth and others. So national sports puts the roar in the 20s. And then there's advertising. What is advertising? Well, advertising is convincing people to buy products they don't really need. And here you have a number of products, whether it be Coca-Cola, still around today, Wrigley's Gum, still around today, Baby Ruth Candy Bar, still around today, Maxwell House Coffee, still around today. And you know, I could have filled slide after slide after slide with the advertising of the day. But the idea is through visual stimulation or through slogans to convince people to buy a product. Why buy Maxwell House coffee over Folgers coffee? Well, because Maxwell House was approved by President Roosevelt. When Maxwell House took their initial offering of coffee and took it to the White House, and President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, tried a cup, and he was asked, well, what did you think, Mr. President? His reply was, hey, that's good to the last drop. Well, notice the slogan, good to the last drop. It became, even to this day, is Maxwell House Coffee's slogan. Baby Ruth Candy Bar becomes the source of a national lawsuit and scandal because, as you can see up above it, Red Rock Cola paid Babe Ruth to use his picture, his name, and his likeness in their advertising. Baby Ruth Candy Bar did not. When Babe Ruth sued Baby Ruth, the Curtis Company, for using his name without paying him royalties, the trial goes to court, and the candy company insists, notice the name difference, that it's named Baby Ruth, not Babe Ruth, because Baby Ruth was named for Ruth Cleveland, who had been born in the White House, or who had been born after Cleveland's first time in the White House, and that later, when Cleveland returned for his second time to the White House, that Cleveland had toured the factory and brought Baby Ruth Cleveland, with them, and that the factory lovers had fallen in love with her and they had named the candy bar in her honor, not Babe Ruth, the baseball player. Well, unfortunately, that's a lie. They, in fact, ripped off Babe Ruth's name. The timeline's not incorrect. Snopes did an investigation of this, and even though Baby Ruth Candy Bar wins their suit against Babe Ruth, in fact, they shouldn't have. Baby Ruth owes Babe Ruth royalties. But that's beside the point. Ironically, I'm not sure that Red Rock Cola is even around today, but Baby Ruth Candy Bar certainly is. Now, is it because they stole the name or whatever? Who knows? But nonetheless, it's still in existence, still enjoyed, and the advertising was successful. I threw in the cigarette ad just for grins and giggles. 20,679 physicians say Luckies are less irritating. Notice it doesn't say they're good for you. It doesn't say that you should smoke it. It just says these are less irritating than those other cigarettes. And so this kind of play on the naivete of Americans to not really follow through. Hey, a physician says it, it's okay. Maybe I should smoke that one. It's kind of like the old the ad that was on a few years back. The doctor from the Love Boat, that he comes down, and I even forget what he's advertising. I wouldn't say if I did. But as he walks down the staircase, he says, "I'm not a doctor, but I played one on TV." And then he proceeds to tell you about this medicine. I was like, whoa, wait a minute, you're not a doctor, so why should I listen to you? Because you played one on TV? Really? Well, the same idea. Physicians say this cigarette's less irritating. Oh, then it must be good for you. Well, that's the assumption. But advertising puts the roar in the 20s. Products of all kinds. America has become a consumer nation, and we have every type of soda, of chewing gum, of car, of food, of appliances. And advertising is the way to get your product before the American people. Verbal advertising on radio, visual advertising and verbal advertising on films, and then in printed media, in magazines, etc. So advertising puts the roar in the 20s. And one of the key elements that puts the roar in the 20s is the automobile. This is the classic age of the American auto, with Henry Ford and his mass production of the Model T, then transitioning into the Model A, but other car companies producing as well. And the car has become accessible to all. But think about the cultural as well as the financial transformation that the car brings. It changes how we approach everything. Think about dating, for instance, and how dating was conducted in 1904, when there was very few, if any, cars around. You didn't drive up in somebody's yard and honk the horn, "Oh, God," and the girl comes running out, and you drive off and make your way to the theater. You didn't do that. In fact, your girl might be, or your significant other might be 5 miles away. Well, that's a half day's walk. You walk in an hour and a half there, you an hour and a half back. If you wanted to go anywhere, that's half your day's shot. And so you socialized, you got together at public events, church socials, community socials, community get-togethers, fairs and hoedowns and things like that. That's when you came together. That's where your dating took place. You didn't date privately. You didn't date as individuals. You dated as a family. You were invited into the home. You ate dinner. If you got any alone time, it was very briefly, and it was usually highly supervised alone time. But now with the auto, the young man or young woman can take their auto, drive to their significant other's house, honk the horn, and off they go. Maybe they make it to the theater, maybe they make it to town, maybe they don't. In fact, the automobile, H.L. Mencken called the automobile the bordello on wheels. A bordello, a whorehouse. It fundamentally changed the dating scene and how people approached courtship, how people approached marriage. It allowed you to go further and further afield for a spouse. Most people, when they got married prior to the automobile, if you married someone, it was someone you had direct social contact with. You usually married someone in the community. Now the automobile makes courtship a long-distance affair. But then look at the automobile itself. It transforms American society. It can't just travel over open ground. In fact, the concept for the interstate system that Dwight Eisenhower will later advocate in the 1950s, some say that, Eisenhower saw the Autobahn system of Germany in World War II, and that's what he brought back, and that's why the Eisenhower interstate system is created in the 50s. That's not totally true. He did see the German Autobahns, but he was already theorizing in the 1920s. Dwight Eisenhower, as a young Army officer after World War I, volunteers for a nationwide experiment to take a group of vehicles and travel from coast to coast. And after witnessing all of the breakdowns, almost not making the journey, the difficulties in traversing the Rocky Mountains, Eisenhower became convinced there needed to be a more simplified road system. And a road system of the magnitude that would require the government to build it. That thought was already in his head in the 1920s, and then it was further solidified during World War II. But think about creating those roads, whether it be busted rock roads. Well, you got to have somebody to bust the rocks, somebody to collect the rocks, somebody to smooth out the roads and to build the road surface. Then to actually have the automobile, you have the steel in the construction. You have the glass, you have the upholstery, you have the rubber. All of that requires companies to build. And then as the road transitions to asphalt, that gets a whole new industry underway. Then to service those automobiles, the growth of mechanic shops. Then to provide fuel for them to go, gas stations. So that now we have a gas station on, sometimes 3 and 4 gas stations on every street corner. A transformation of the way Americans traveled and did business. And that was followed very closely, and the connection being Henry Ford. Henry Ford not only pioneering automobile construction, but in America he also specialized in the construction of aviation. Now, some of these planes being used out of World War I, but Ford will also pioneer, and you see in the middle bottom, the Ford 5ATB, a Ford Trimotor, which became one of the first civilian transports in the United States. But out of World War I, as that reaction to and what puts the roar in the 20s is civilian aviation. Highlighted by American aviators. Those pilots trained in the AEF come home and with nothing better to do, maybe not a job, but wanting to stay in aviation, they become entertainers. This is the age of the barnstormers. A barnstormer were pilots that would, in essence, you would open up both ends of a barn and they would fly their biplane through the barn. Daredevils, if you will. But what they needed to do to stay in the air, to stay in the pilot seat. But it transforms American life. You will see on all of these planes, if you look with great detail, they all carry a phrase on it that says U.S. mail. All of these planes are engaged in the mail service. With the mail service, it gave the money necessary then for men like Eddie Rickenbacker, the American ace of aces, to be instrumental in establishing the Eastern Air Transport Service, which grew out of other industries, specifically on the East Coast. That's why the plane is labeled Florida Airways. Eastern Air Transport was built out of other small regional services, one of them being Florida Airways, but it became Eastern Air Transport to carry mail and then passengers on the East Coast. You see in its infancy American Airways, which becomes American Airlines. The Boeing industry transforming air travel with the invention of its Model 80, which was preceded by the Model 40. Pan American Airways, transcontinental air transport. All of these are American passenger mail-carrying airplanes that revolutionized the way Americans did business. You see the inset with the interior of the plane. Later, this would even be spread out more with cooking stations, etc. But the first air transports weren't that much different from today as far as their legroom and comfort level. But this was popularized not only by the barnstormers and by heroes like Eddie Rickenbacker, but in 1927, Charles Lindbergh, a former Army pilot who had entered civilian life as one of those mail carriers. And you see in the bottom picture, Charles Lindbergh with Henry Ford on one side and Edsel Ford on the other, a connection between the air transport and car transport. But Charles Lindbergh would be one of those transcontinental pilots flying across the Rocky Mountains, across the desert, delivering mail to California. And he develops and desires the concept of flying solo across the Atlantic Ocean. And so on May 20th, 21st, 1927, Charles Lindbergh becomes the first person to solo fly across the Atlantic in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, to honor the city that put up a lot of the funding and helped him develop the aircraft. And so Charles Lindbergh becomes a national hero, a national icon, so much so that he enters politics in 1928. Doesn't do well, but he entered politics. And he's going to remain involved in politics through the 1930s until he's discredited, being honored by, he will spearhead the America First campaign to keep the United States out of World War II. But when it becomes public knowledge that he was awarded honors by Adolf Hitler and Hermann Goering, he kind of falls from grace, and he becomes a national icon immediately after in the 20s, because his child will be abducted and becomes a national scandal, the abduction and death of baby Lindbergh. But Charles Lindbergh and the press and the media surrounding his flights becomes a national icon. Let's look at the politics of the 1920s. Americans were in a reaction to the World War I and the 19-teens, even a reaction against the Progressive era, as we saw with Warren Harding. But behind the scenes, one of the chief motivating factors, and you could say, well, this continues to put the roar in the 20s, is a reaction to all things foreign. That it was foreign ideas, foreign nations, foreign concepts that got the nation into the war, that we had violated Washington's call for isolation at our own peril. And so groups like the Ku Klux Klan marched, and this is a 1925 march in Washington, D.C., marching against foreign immigration. But even before that, and they want a total elimination, but the Klan will rise to some of its highest levels ever in the post-World War I era. But Congress responds to the agitation immediately following the war with the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921. The Emergency Immigration Act of 1921, which said that Congress would set a quota on the number of immigrants that could come to America. And as you can see on the funnel, the metaphorical funnel funneling Europeans into America, Uncle Sam is sliding a 3% gate into the funnel to restrict the flow. Well, what that symbolizes is in the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, newcomers into America were restricted to 3% of the population totals from that nation in the 1910 census. So let's take Germany, for instance. Looking at the 1910 census, whatever figure is derived from the 1910 census, that's the number of Germans living in America. Let's call it 3 million. I'm just making up a number there. But let's call it 3 million. Then 3% of that becomes the number of Germans allowed into the United States each year. So a restriction of the numbers. Using the 1910 census, only 3% of each national group are allowed into the United States, with the exception of Canada and Mexico, and there are no laws restricting Canadian or Mexican immigration. This was replaced in 1924 by the Immigration Act of 1924, in which the government said, hey, there's too many foreigners coming in. Let's replace the 3% gate with a 2% gate, and instead of using the 1910 census, let's back it up to the 1890 census. So using the 1890 census, when there were less Southern Europeans, Italians and from the Balkans and Eastern Europe in the United States, using that 1890 census instead of the 1910 and reducing it to 2% from 3%. For the first time in American history in 1931, more people will leave the United States than came to the United States. And so the agitation on immigration is going to help put the roar in the 20s. In addition, while the men were away fighting in World War I, the 18th Amendment as a wartime measure, and we talked about this last time, the 18th Amendment was advocated and passed. And so in 1920, the noble experiment, prohibition, was put in place. It actually took effect in 1919. But the legal abolition of alcohol and the sale and distribution of alcohol, you could still consume privately in your home, but you had no way of getting it without buying it illegally because distribution was declared illegal. And so with the advent of prohibition, the nation gave prohibition a try. Unfortunately, when something that most Americans agree with is made illegal, they're going to take it. They're going to get it. And so with the advent of prohibition also brings the rise of gangland violence and gangland wars. Two of the top gangsters of the day fighting in Chicago, Al Capone and Bugsy Moran, responsible for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And so as gang violence, turf wars over the distribution of illegal alcohol led to increasing gang fights, the police caught in the middle, all sides using the Thompson submachine gun with a 100-round drum. Of course, there are civilian casualties caught in the crossfire, and gang violence becomes the order of the day. It becomes a national passion. When you really think of it, gangland violence, illegal activity. Yet what's one of the more popular genres in American cinema and American life? Well, The Godfather, The Sopranos, just to name two of huge franchises that focus around the mafia and mob rule. So the rise of gangland violence because of the noble experiment. So the 1920s, probably one of the most drinkingest decades, and yet alcohol is illegal. Even President Harding going to the little house on K Street to get his booze illegally. The 1920s are also a time of high-profile trials. Probably the first spectacle trial, if you will, is the trial of Roscoe Fatty Conkling Arbuckle. He was one of the most popular actors of his day. Not only popular, but highest paid actors of his day. Being a silent film star, in 1920, he signed a contract for $1 million. $1 million in 1920. That's the equivalent of probably about $15 million today. A huge sum of money. So with that success, in 1921, he was accused, as you can see in the newspaper article, he was accused of the assault, rape, and murder of Virginia Rappy. She was another actress that had starred in some of the films with him. Fatty Arbuckle, as he was called, held a party. Even while they were filming, he held a party. A large group of people were there. He invited Virginia to the party. She had a disease that alcohol exacerbated. And while at the party, she fell ill and four days later died. Well, one of her friends accused Arbuckle of raping her and then killing her. Now, there was almost no evidence, but because he was such a high-profile figure, one of the first real Hollywood scandals, he was brought. His case was brought before a grand jury. It was brought to trial twice. The most salacious, and for the sake of not offending or causing anybody uncomfort, I won't go into the details, but when it was determined that he hadn't raped her, there was the accusation that he had misused ice on her, which in fact he did use ice, but she was complaining of stomach cramps, and the people who backed up his testimony said he used the ice on her stomach to try to reduce the cramps. There was no sexual thing with ice. But nonetheless, the salacious stories, fueled by William Randolph Hearst. Hearst makes millions in the sale of newspapers and the sale of news stories regarding the Arbuckle trials. But twice it goes before juries, twice there are hung juries, and then the third time it goes before a jury, Roscoe Conklin Arbuckle was acquitted, found not guilty. But his reputation had been destroyed. Most of his film contracts had been nullified because of the scandals. His movies had been pulled. And as he was rebuilding his career in the early 1930s, it was said that on the night of signing his first big contract since the death of Virginia Rappy, he had a heart attack and died. But why do you need to know this? Well, it was the first time that a national scandal of this nature, Hollywood on display for the world, and the salacious nature of the story, the way that it quickly ran to a sexual nature, and people desired to know it. They were scandalized by it, but at the same time they couldn't get enough of it. And media made a fortune off of the Fatty Arbuckle trials. That was followed in 1924 by another very high-profile trial, the murder trial for the killers of Bobby Franks. Bobby Franks was a 14-year-old boy, and it was quickly determined that Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb were responsible for his death. Two very affluent young men, college students at the University of Chicago, kidnapped and murdered this 14-year-old boy to prove that they could commit the perfect crime. Well, they were caught. Both of them ultimately confessed, but their daddies hired Clarence Darrow, the nation's top defense attorney, to defend them. And in his impassioned defense, this trial was carried once again nationwide. It was fueled by Hearst media. Millions were made off of the salacious details of this murder. And both Leopold and Loeb were convicted. And instead of the death penalty, Clarence Darrow was able to talk the judge into life in prison. But one more time, a salacious national media frenzy. Followed in 1925 by the Scopes monkey trial. Tennessee made teaching of evolution illegal by state law. And as with many experiments of this nature, the ACLU and other groups put up money and made it clear that if someone violated the law and were prosecuted under the law, that they would provide defense. And so to challenge the Tennessee law, he's not just an innocent bystander that happened to accidentally teach Darwinism in the classroom. John Scopes was a biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee. He goes in a highly publicized way teaches Darwinism, teaches evolution in the classroom so that he would be ticketed. And then that ticket, he's not arrested, he's ticketed. But then the appeal of that ticket all the way up to the Tennessee Supreme Court. And that's what you see in 1925 is the national trial, evolution versus fundamentalism as it's been billed. But this biology teacher teaching evolution in the classroom. The national attorney for Leopold and Loeb, who had gained national prominence as a defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, is hired to defend Scopes. And as an expert witness for the prosecution, Tennessee brings in William Jennings Bryan to defend the Bible. And over the course of the summer of 1925, the issue of Darwinism versus creationism is publicly debated, carried in national media. Once again, the newspapers make millions off of the trial. It's carried on national radio. It becomes yet another feeding frenzy of the media. And in the trial, William Jennings Bryan stumbles around, doesn't seem to know his Bible, even though he was a Methodist preacher as well. He seemed to be confused. And Clarence Darrow seemed to have his way, if you will, with Bryan in his cross-examination. But in the end, William Jennings Bryan's point of view is upheld by the Tennessee Supreme Court. It finds that the law was not in violation, but it dismisses the ticket against John Scopes. Because the ticket was dismissed, Scopes didn't suffer any injury, therefore it couldn't be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. It was made to go away. But it was that third national spectacle, if you will, the Scopes monkey trial. And last but not least, and there were others, but the last one we're going to look at is the 1926 trial of Aimee Semple McPherson. Aimee McPherson was a female evangelist in California, in Los Angeles. She established the Foursquare Gospel and regularly preached in the Angelus Temple in Los Angeles. She was a national icon in a day and an age when women were seeking their place. Here's a woman that was proclaiming the gospel to a national audience via radio, via newspaper. She had a huge following, especially in California. And in May of 1926, while swimming and beach going at Venice Beach, she disappeared. Some thought she had drowned in the Pacific Ocean. 5 weeks later, she shows up. She's found in Mexico, made her way, having escaped from what she claimed were kidnappers. With the escape of Aimee Semple McPherson, some called it a media hoax. They called it a fraud. That she hadn't been kidnapped, that it was a publicity stunt. That's the word I was looking for, publicity stunt. And so Aimee Semple McPherson was put on trial for fraud. After weeks and months of trial, with limited evidence against her and more evidence in her favor, it was determined that she wasn't guilty of fraud, that she was in fact kidnapped. But as William Randolph Hearst said, he made millions from keeping the story in the papers and keeping the publicity going, so much so that her career was effectively damaged by the media frenzy and the national attention given to her, even though she was in fact found innocent. And so Aimee Semple McPherson becomes that example, that last example, if you will, of the national feeding frenzy on a court case. These are the things that put a roar in the 20s. Now, behind all of this is the environment of business, especially the environment created by President Calvin Coolidge and his presidency.